What if I told you we miss something so fundamental in education that without it, no learning matters? Or what if I told you your child has the potential to change the world, but is being educated out of it? Imagine for a second that you are 6 years old. The world is full of wonder. You have far more questions than answers, and you are filled with curiosity. Life is an adventure. Life is learning. You're excited because now you're ready to step into the shoes of a real student, go off to school. But that spontaneous and flexible structure to your learning suddenly becomes rigid and controlled, and ever so slowly the adventure of learning becomes the drudgery of performance. You'll spend more than a decade performing on tests for grades, learning how to be just like everyone else, rather than discovering how your unique gifts and passions could be used to change the world. Now, if you're like Canyon, someone who I'll share more about with you soon, not only will you lose that natural love of learning, but anxiety will turn to frustration, anger, and defiance. And if you're like Canyon, because you learn differently, you will be labeled with a learning disability. So over the last few years, I've been on an unexpected journey through education. For us, seeing our little girl struggle with self-confidence and begin to lose that natural love of learning sparked what would become one of our greatest adventures. I mean, it started like you would imagine, looking at alternatives and considering homeschool. But nothing seemed quite to fit. And frankly, we had a little bit of a different problem. See, we had lived in Austin, Texas, and we had become intimately familiar with the Acton Academy. See, Acton was different. To us, Acton represented everything we wanted out of a school experience. Children who felt honored and trusted were given the responsibility for their learning. They were discovering things about themselves and life that I'm afraid few adults ever do. And so I just couldn't shake the thought, start an Acton Academy. So we gathered a couple courageous families in our hometown of Boise, Idaho, and we started Heroes Academy, part of the network of Acton Academies that are now sprouting across the globe. And since I've started this adventure, I've come to believe that traditional education has missed something really important, something with such lasting implications that without it, I would argue no learning matters. That's what I'm going to share with you today. So one of my favorite Disney movies is Hercules. It starts with Hercules, who's taken from his home in Mount Olympus, and he's turned human by Hades, the god of the underworld. Now, early on, Hercules is really awkward. He just doesn't quite know how to use his special strength and gifts. But eventually, Hercules discovers that he is the son of Zeus, that he has this divine potential, but that in order to return home to Mount Olympus, he must become a true hero. So he sets out on this adventure to prove himself the hero he was meant to be. And he finds Philoctetes, who trains him and guides him to using his special strength. And he goes on to slay dragons and kill beasts, and he saves cities and he saves lives. Ultimately, though, Hercules is forced into a great dilemma. He must give up his own life to save the life of the woman he has come to love, Meg. And in a moment of love, he jumps into the river of souls, giving up everything he's worked for, even his own life, to save her. And as he's reaching to her, nearly dead, light and strength return to him. Why? Because he has become a true hero. I love this story. I think it's super inspiring, and stories like it. And it follows this narrative that in psychology is often referred to as the archetype of the hero, or the hero's journey. And many psychologists, like Carl Jung, believe that this narrative lies deep inside our subconscious. And it's why we engage so heavily in books and movies and stories where a character takes on a journey of adventure and challenge and ultimately transformation. But the most interesting part about the movie Hercules, if you've ever seen it, is you watch for like an hour and a half as Hercules tries to return home to Mount Olympus. And as he's almost there, he simply declines and decides to stay on Earth with Meg. Doesn't that just tick you off just a little bit? Like for me, that's frustrating. Or at least it should be, but it's not. And here's why. Because it wasn't about returning to Mount Olympus. The journey was about Hercules. It was about who he became and how he transformed on the journey that matters to us. That's what tells us something deep about ourselves and what we long for. We're talking about origins today, who we are and where we're going. And I believe the hero's journey is a narrative that will help us look at life in a different lens. This idea that life is more about looking at it as a series of challenges, meaningful and transformative challenges that take us on an adventure, where ultimately it is who we become that matters to us. And if we can look at life in this way as challenges to face, that we will find that that is the secret to happy marriages, meaningful relationships, and fulfilling work. And so that's why we created Heroes Academy, to be a place where children could embark on a meaningful adventure, where they would encounter the natural challenges of learning. And as a result, they would become courageous, self-confident, resilient, kind, developing a deep sense of how their unique gifts and passions could be used to change the world. So there are 4 great leaders I think we can look to as we create the environment for our children not to just learn, but to transform in preparation for the rest of their lives. The first is Maria Montessori. Maria Montessori believed that trust and independence was the cornerstone of all learning. For us, this looks like trusting each child with the responsibility for their learning, letting them learn at their own pace and in their own way. We don't ever force a child to learn at Heroes Academy. Yet, one of our students finished 1st and 2nd grade in 6 months. One finished 5th grade in 5 months. And one tested out of high school this year as a 6th grader. We can trust our children with their learning, especially if we get the next things right. Socrates. The idea of being a guide, not a teacher. 50 years ago, the most valuable source of information might have been a teacher in the classroom. But today it's not. We're surrounded by world-class technology and world-class teachers. What we need are guides who can help equip our children to think for themselves and to solve their own problems, who won't step in at every problem that occurs, rather letting children figure things out on their own and equipping them with real skills like setting goals, getting unstuck, staying focused, or working with others and solving interpersonal conflicts. Next is Jeff Bezos, Amazon, the idea of world-class processes and systems that deliver the highest standards of excellence. There are no shortcuts on the road to mastery and the road to changing the world. So proving mastery at each stage of your learning before you move on. And finally, Steve Jobs and Apple, a call to change the world, finding what that is that you do especially well. What are your gifts and passions? What calls to you? Early on in the experience at Heroes Academy, this looks like exposure to new ideas through real-world projects and experiences. This might be creating a product to sell at a children's business fair, or it might be doing some forensic science to discover the culprit of a real crime. Real-world experiences that challenge you. Eventually, this looks like apprenticeships, stepping into the real world, finding something in the world that matches that deep, burning need in your heart. And ultimately what this means is inspiring each child to believe that they are a hero on a hero's journey, destined to change the world. Now, the beauty of this type of environment where you trust children with their learning, you inspire them as to why it matters, and you equip them to tackle that learning, is they get to begin to face the challenges that you and I face every day. And not only that, they learn to overcome them in preparation for life's real challenges. There are 3 in particular. Jeff Sandifer, one of the founders of Acton Academy, refers to these as the 3 horsemen, and I like that analogy. The first is distraction, giving up long-term goals in exchange for short-term thrills. The second is resistance, not wanting to do that hard thing that you know you need to do. And third is victimhood, feeling like you are controlled by the world around you rather than in control of your own destiny. That's probably the hardest one to eradicate. Jumped too soon on that one for you. Let me tell you why this matters so much. Because there's going to be a time in the lives of our children where the choices that they make are entirely theirs. If they're not being prepared to make meaningful choices on their own, if they can't overcome distraction now, or resistance, or victimhood, the consequences of that down the road are significantly larger. It looks different, possibly more permanent. Anything short of empowering our children to make meaningful choices on their own is a fool's errand. So to get really practical for you, I want to share with you how you might learn in this type of environment. So for example, how might you learn to read? So this is my daughter, Adri. What she's doing here is she set a goal to read this book. It's a Bob book. It gets progressively harder. And what she's doing is she's got her headphones on because she's Googling the words she doesn't know so she can look at videos that teach her not only how to say it, but what it means. Once she has finished the book, she will go to somebody and prove that she knows how to read that book, that she's mastered it. Then she'll get it checked off on some sort of tracking system. Well, this is her about 4 months later. She's finished all 50 books in the series and essentially has taught herself to read. Now, Adri's become an exceptional reader. But more importantly, she's developing the habits of lifelong learning, setting goals, staying focused, pushing through when it's hard, being in control of her own learning, not waiting for people to solve her problems. Now, there are 3 stories in particular that I want to share with you that I think epitomize why this is so important for our young people. And the first is Kai. I want to tell you about Kai. So when Kai started with us last year, he really struggled to read. So much so that he got to a point where he couldn't even read his math problems. Now, this was a particularly difficult thing for him, more than I've seen in most kids. But we gave him world-class tools to learn, we trusted him with that responsibility, and we encouraged him and shared with him why that is important. And it was about 10 months later, I'm looking at some data, and I've noticed that Kai has finished about 50% of a year's worth of math in 3 days. So I go up to him, dude, Kai, what's going on? You just busted through a bunch of math. What happened? And he gets this big smile on his face, and he looks at me and he says, I can read the problems now. Kai would have been swallowed up in a regular school. He would have felt significantly inferior. But what story do you think he is telling himself now? I can almost hear him saying, I did that. I can do hard things. To me, Kai is a hero. He took on a meaningful challenge, he slayed his dragon, and he transformed. And I can Kai learned to read. That's a skill that's going to matter for the rest of his life. But honestly, that seems like a cheap lesson compared to what he learned about himself and what he can do, especially as he sets goals and stays determined. And I think that's the power of transformation. The second story is about Olivia, just about the nicest girl you could possibly imagine. Well, so at Heroes Academy, you're not just responsible for your learning. You're also responsible for your community. And that community is created through a series of promises and commitments that you make with one another. And it forms in the form of a studio contract. So you're not just learning to keep your promises, you're also learning to hold people accountable to theirs. Now, if you're as nice as Olivia, that's particularly challenging. You can imagine how much courage that might take. Well, she was struggling with a particular situation, and she came up to me one day and she told me this. She said, someone I've been playing with has been hurting my feelings and I don't like it. Keep in mind, this has been happening for some time. She says, today I stood up for myself and I held them accountable, and I feel good about it. I think I did something really good, standing up for myself. Olivia found her voice that day. And her mom often comments now about the increased confidence that she and others see in her daughter. If you can think for a second about the implications of this lesson, the ability to hold a firm line. Now, I'm a dad, and I have a daughter, as you've seen. To think about her having the courage and ability to hold a firm line in her relationships is extremely important to me. So I'm proud of what Olivia has done. And no one saved her through this experience. She had to learn this on her own, with encouragement and compassion along the way. And that's how a child transforms. Last story I want to share with you is Canyon. Canyon's that boy early on I shared with you, I promised you I'd circle back to, labeled with a learning disability. Canyon's family was the first family courageous enough to join us on our journey at Heroes Academy. And honestly, I was super nervous. Canyon's family went to our same church, and even his teachers would tell me how defiant he was. Early on, Canyon proved that he truly was defiant. In fact, I came home the first day. I told my wife, Canyon's not going to make it. And I hated the predicament that I put myself into because these are my friends. Well, a couple days passed by, and Canyon had crossed 3 major boundaries. And on the 3rd offense, you're essentially asked to leave. To come back, Canyon would have to write a letter describing how he would change and be a contributing member to the community. And talking to his dad was sure he wouldn't write the letter. I thought the same thing, and I figured that would be the unfortunate and uncomfortable ending of it. But it wasn't. A few days later, Canyon returned, letter in hand. He had explained and shared with the community how he would change. And he was welcomed back into the community. And Canyon, through that experience, transformed. He came back ready to keep the promises that he chose to make. Canyon is now a contributing member of our community. He's looked to for help. He keeps his promises. And at the end of school one day, just a couple weeks after this experience, I heard Canyon yell, "I wish school was 24 hours." His transformation has been inspiring. It has taught me to believe in these young people and what they're capable of, something I think we're missing. I can only imagine how his life has changed now that he knows the impact of his choices. So as I've had a chance to walk alongside these young people the last few years, I've come to believe something deeply, that knowledge is important, but it means very little if our children do not transform in preparation for the rest of their lives. So what if they get good grades if at the end of the day they don't believe in themselves? So what if they do well on tests if they can't say no to things like drugs, alcohol, pornography, or other worldly vices? Or so what if they can get straight A's, but they don't take on any meaningful challenges because they fear failure or can't do hard things? Or so what if they get into elite colleges, if they don't recognize that the greatest joys in life don't come from serving ourselves? They come from using our gifts to serve others. Now, we don't have everything figured out at Heroes Academy. We learn things every day. But one thing will never change. We will never stop focusing on the transformation of these young people, because every time one of them transforms, the world changes, and we get to change a little bit too. Thank you.